So, welcome to our very first all-digital Pass the Torch program, coming to you from the comforts of our living rooms and home offices. My name is Joseph Vick, Manager of Museum Education here at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama. Today's program is titled The Stories Behind the Exhibits, an Outward Odyssey book series space history author panel discussion on the importance of museums and their valuable history they teach us all. So let's begin with a warm welcome and introduction to all our panelists in order of their historical focus. First, we have Chris Petty. Chris is a space and aviation enthusiast and author of the High Frontier blog. His articles have appeared on Adam Savage's Tested site and the Space Review. And his first book, Beyond Blue Skies, the rocket plane programs that led to the space age, is due for publication this November as part of the Outward Odyssey series. Welcome, Chris, to the panel.
Hi.
Dear friend of the Rocket Center and Space Camp Hall of Famer, Francis French brings international experience in relating science, engineering, music, astronomy, art, and wildlife to general audiences through classes, workshops, and public speaking, television and documentary productions. He is the author of numerous best-selling history books, including The Shadow of the Moon, and an international keynote speaker at conferences all over. Welcome, Francis.
Hi, Joe. Good to be here.
Amy Shira Teitel holds a bachelor's degree with combined honors in history of science and technology and classics from the University of King's College and Dalhousie University, and the master's degree in science and technology studies from York University. She is the author of 2 books, Breaking the Chains of Gravity and Fighting for Space, and tells the story of female pilots in the time of America's transition into the space age. She maintains her blog, The Vintage Space, on Medium, as well as its companion YouTube channel. She also loves early aviation, early technological evolutions, and she's endlessly fascinated with mid-century America. She also loves punk rock, boxing, bowling, old movies, thinks fashion can be immensely powerful, and still plays her Super Nintendo. Born in Toronto, Canada, she lives in Pasadena, California, with her adult kitten, Pete Conrad. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you. Hello. And Pete might be coming up to say hello in a bit. I'll try to coax him.
He's welcome, too. John Youskauskas is a professional pilot and space history writer. He's been involved in 3 Outward Odyssey books. As a contributor to Footprints in the Dust and Fallen Astronauts, and as a co-author to Come Fly With Us with Melvin Croft, with whom he's currently working on a new about all-around history of spacewalks. John is a professional pilot with over 10,000 hours of flight time and over 30 years in airline and private jet businesses, licensed as an air transport pilot, a certified flight instructor, and an airframe and power plant mechanic. Welcome, John, to the panel.
Thank you, Joe. Great to be here with all these fantastic authors.
We have David Hitt. David is a co-author of 2 books, Homesteading Space, the Skylab Story, written with astronauts Owen Garriott and Joe Kerwin, and Bold They Rise, the Space Shuttle Early Years. David has worked at NASA Marshall Space Flight Center since 2002 and currently serves as a payload engagement strategist for NASA's Space Launch System, working with scientists and mission developers interested in launching spacecraft on America's next generation heavy lift rocket that will return astronauts to the moon. A contractor employee with ASRC Federal, David is a recipient of the Silver Snoopy Award given by NASA's Astronaut Office. A former newspaper editor, David is a native of Huntsville, Alabama, and holds a bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of Mississippi. He is a former chair of the National Space Society's Policy Formulation Committee and serves as volunteer at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center Museum in Huntsville, Alabama, a role he began during the restoration efforts for the center's Skylab trainer. He and his wife, Rebecca, have 1 son, Owen. Welcome, David.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
And welcome one and all. So let's start with our questions. So I'll start with our first person that I mentioned in our bio. So Chris, could you start us off by please describe your first ever life-changing museum experience, that aha moment that made you realize that you were a fellow space geek? And if you can remember the exact exhibit or artifact, please elaborate. So Chris?
Okay, so I get to go first. It's been a long time since that first aha moment, I have to say. But for me, it wasn't actually a museum exhibit, and it wasn't a museum visit. It was a book that came from a museum.
Oh.
So when I was just a little kid, give my age away here, my grandfather, he came across to the US for the bicentennial. And while he was over, he was lucky enough to visit the National Air and Space Museum just after it reopened. And he brought a book back with him. And he showed me the book, and it had a picture of the X-15 in it. And I was really into planes, and I was really into space because I was kind of born into that immediate afterglow of Apollo. And then he showed me this picture of this plane that flew into space. And there's this great illustration with it soaring over the Earth with flames coming out the back of it. And that was kind of that. That was when I was nearly 5 years old, and I'm still dreaming about the X-15 now.
Great. For our younger viewers watching, 1976 was the American celebration of the bicentennial, and there were all kinds of celebrations, new quarters and new all the aboves that happened at that time. So Francis, let's move to you. So what was your aha moment that you experienced within museums?
Growing up in the UK as well, a similar kind of backstory in that when you're in the UK, you don't get much space stuff, particularly in the 70s and 80s. England wasn't doing that much with the space program. So I would go down to London where the Apollo 10 spacecraft was and look at it like this sort of holy relic. I mean, like, oh my goodness, it's a real spacecraft. And when I'm back next year, maybe I'll get to see this one thing again. But then as a teenager, I came to Huntsville, Alabama and Space Academy, the college version of Space Camp, at which point my mind was blown. That was the place that really sold it on me. I'd been to the Cape, I'd been to Houston, but not much was happening at that time. But to actually come to Space Camp and immersively get into those things, and to see that enormous Saturn V rocket, and to see Apollo 16, and just see room after room of things, the full-scale Skylab trailer, another Skylab trainer outside, more than one Skylab. I mean, good grief, how better can it get? I think at that point I was totally sold on the space program, because what you have in Alabama is a real gem, and I really wish more people would get out that way to see it.
Amy, what about you? What was your aha moment?
Well, I wish I had an Alabama aha moment. I've actually never been out there. I don't think I've even been to the state, but one of these days. Everyone's like, oh, and then I went to space camp. I'm like, I'm still jealous. I still want to go. For me, my aha moment, and I'm looking around my desk, but the book is not next to me. It also came from a book. I'm from Canada, and you don't have NASA everywhere in Canada, so it wasn't something that I kind of grew up knowing about the moon landings. So when I was a kid, doing a second grade project on Venus, which I already thought was like the most incredible thing not in the world, because it's like the Earth, but going backwards and roastingly hot, but you can see it without binoculars. I had this book that had a 2-page spread on each planet and on the moon and on, the space shuttle at the time was what was coming up. And there was one on the moon that had 2 Apollo astronauts. And I just thought, wait, people went to the moon? Why was I not informed? And then I just had to know why, because why did no one tell me that happened? It was so cool. And that really launched my love of Apollo. And I already kind of had this really fascination, even as a kid, of when technology is first developed. So learning about how they went to the moon the first time is still a question that I enjoy digging into, because the more you ask, the more you learn, the bigger the answer gets.
Great. John, what about you? What was your aha moment?
Well, I was one of the lucky ones that grew up in the Baltimore, Washington area. And you mentioned the bicentennial. July 1st of 76 was the opening day of the Air and Space Museum there. And I happened to be there that day with my family.
And it was it's hard not to be inspired in a place like that when you walk in, and in one gallery you have the Apollo 11 command module that went to the moon, you have the Gemini 4 spacecraft, you have John Glenn's Friendship 7, and then hanging from the ceiling is the Spirit of St. Louis, the Bell X-1, the #1 X-15 aircraft, and the original Wright Flyer that the Wright brothers built and flew at Kitty Hawk. So in that one room, you can look around and see this entire history of air and space flight. Over the years, and I stayed there for a long time in that area, all the famous test pilots and astronauts would come and speak there in the big IMAX movie theater. So over the years, I've met all the Apollo astronauts, the test pilots like Chuck Yeager, Scott Crossfield, Joe Engle. They would come there with a lot of regularity, in some cases annually, and give these amazing speeches and then hang around and talk to everybody afterwards. So later on, when you go and read books, to me it was different because I've seen those spacecraft, I've met those people. It was a lot more relatable, and then that's kind of what started my interest in an aviation career. But very, very lucky to have grown up in that area and had access to such a fantastic museum. And
David, what about you?
So my story is kind of more like John's. Growing up here in Huntsville, having the Space and Rocket Center in my backyard, you see a Saturn rocket on a regular basis as you're driving through town. I mean, it's kind of inescapable. I mean, you really can't come out of that sort of environment and not have it in your blood a little bit. So just, you know, the ambient influence of something so iconic being so present in your life.
Well, in the first question, two of you, so Amy and Chris, you already touched point on this next question, so we'll allow the other panelists to make their answers known for this one. But what was the first book or historical event you remember reading and experiencing firsthand that inspired you to become an author or historic space nonfiction writer? So what was that book? So let's go with Francis.
So I remember as a very little kid going into my local library, which I could walk to, sort of waddle along the street in time, it seemed like miles away, but of course as a kid, everything seems far away. Going in and picking up one of those children's books that was not even on a shelf because I was too small to reach. It was in like a bin in the middle of the library. You pulled it out and there were all the space patches on the back. And it's hard to really remember how iconic space patches are before you can't really read. You see this visual, you get the drama of a mission, and to have all the Apollo space patches on the back of this children's book really brought it home to me. But I was growing up at a time between Apollo and the shuttle when not that much was happening until the first space shuttle mission, and that's what I really remember. I remember sitting in my front room, endlessly calling other people in my family in, come and watch, and nothing was happening for another hour, so they kept disappearing, just waiting for this thing to launch. And had I known how dangerous that first shuttle launch was, this is the first time they'd launched a human space vehicle without ever testing it before. I mean, it was amazing to watch, but it was even more incredible if you were actually in that program and knowing how risky that was. That was really my generation of space firsts. And so to watch that live on television is something that's burned into my mind.
So what about John, what about you? What was your first media or book experience that you remember changing your career into what you are an author now?
Yeah, I was talking about in my elementary school days, we would read about these guys in textbooks. So the stories about John Glenn and Gus Grissom, the first time I had ever read a story about them was in a school book. They were the heroes of that day, and we all grew up knowing who they were. I remember reading about John Glenn going through a fireball in space, and I thought, wow, there's fireballs in space at that age. I didn't know that they were talking about the reentry of the vehicle. So it was all very exciting and interesting. But beyond that, I think my earliest books I remember picking up as a maybe not quite teenager were things like the Space Shuttle Operator's Manual. So I was very interested in the technical side of things, and flipping through that, it was almost like a flight operations manual for the space shuttle. It was really interesting technical things to me.
David, what about you? What was your first book media that you were inspired by?
So I'll say these first two questions are my two books in a nutshell. Homesteading Space, The birth of that book came out of standing in the Skylab exhibit at Space Center Houston, looking at that, saying, somebody really ought to write a book about this, and nobody else was in the line. so I ponied up. On not the book, but the historical event. Yeah, I mean, like Francis, I was born a week after Apollo-Soyuz landed. So I missed the Apollo era by, that much. But as a result of that, yeah, for STS-1, I'm 5 years old. I'm old enough to kind of know it and appreciate it and know what's going on. And so, my dad put me in front of the TV and said, here, we're going to watch this. And that's Bold They Rise. I mean, both of those books, a museum or a historical event, there's a one for one. In terms of something that I read, not even a book, but I would have been in elementary school. They had the little, I forget if it was Weekly Reader or Scholastic News or whatever it was, the little 4-page thing that they would put on your desk every week. And I had a copy, front page story that the president said, we're going to build a space station. I have that copy of Weekly Reader when I was supporting NASA education, when I was a contractor doing writing for education for NASA. That was kind of my inspiration, is if I could write one thing that some kid would put in a folder for 30 years. Now, I've succeeded at my job, but it really captured the power of that early influence can have in, not only getting somebody excited about something, but in, shaping the course of a life, really.
Now, David, on that Scholastic Reader document, was that a Freedom Station that was being mentioned?
It would become Freedom, yes.
Okay.
It was before there was a name.
All right. Amy or Chris, is there any other historical event? You mentioned the book earlier, but is there any sort of tie-in historical event you'd like to make mention of?
Amy, you want to go first?
Sure. I'll just throw this one out for the sake of conversation because David mentioned, living in Huntsville and you get to drive by a Saturn V all the time, which also super jealous. The first time I saw a Saturn V was at the Saturn V, the Apollo Saturn Center at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. And I was an adult. I was, in my mid or late 20s. So, not a formative by kid standards. I already had my first book, was either coming out or out already. But I looked at that thing and it walks you through, a very American centric view of the space race and then kind of the Apollo 8 launch, which is beautifully recreated. And then it opens you up to the business end of this massive rocket. And I just looked at it and I was like, ooh, expletive, which I tried not to do. And there were kids running around and I'm like, oh, darn it. I just couldn't fathom the size of this thing. And I just stood and stared at it for 2 hours. And I was there for the Astronaut Scholarship Foundation event, and I was at the dinner that night, and the gentleman sat down next to me at dinner and said, oh, you look familiar. You were the girl who was standing in the center just staring at the rocket for 2 hours. I've had the luck to be alone with 2 Saturn Vs shooting various TV interviews and stuff, and it's the most incredible thing to be it's me and a camera guy and a director, and I'm I'm just going to go for a walk while you guys sit up. Just to look at it alone. Yeah. Everyone go to Huntsville.
And Chris, would you like to add to that?
I haven't seen a Saturn V yet. One of these days.
You need to come to Huntsville.
Yeah, I do. Man, I'd come out there now if that was an option. But yeah, for me, I guess, kind of like Francis, I had to learn a lot through the books because there was so little I could directly go and see. But I got given this book for, I think this was about my 5th birthday. And this is it's a really cool book and it's got all these great illustrations in it. But it had this one page in particular, and it's called The Shape of Things to Come. And it's got a couple of lifting bodies, it's got an Air Force Flight Dynamics Lab FDL shape there. It's got the Prime, it's got HL10. And that really impressed me because, I thought the rockets were pretty cool, but the idea of space planes and stuff. So I had this book from that age, and then I found this copy Very
Okay,
recently.
the title. So we have Rockets and Missiles.
Rockets and Missiles by David Munday. And it's got a great illustration of not Skylab, but a pre-Skylab space station in it that David might like.
That's beautiful.
Nice.
Apollo Applications Wet Workshop there. But yeah, so I mean, it was really a case of finding whatever books I could and just reading more and more and just being fascinated, and then not going into a career that had anything to do with it, and then working my way back to writing a book a lot later.
Well, let's move to our next question here. So, as historians or historic writers and authors, what does the following quote attributed to writer and philosopher George Santayana, how does this affect your view of writing, describing, and experiencing history through various media? And I quote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it," end quote. So we'll start with David this time.
Let me tell you, I could not be more blessed in my career to have had the opportunity to write 2 books about spaceflight history, starting with development programs, writing about Skylab from development forward, writing about Space Shuttle from development forward, and then somehow accidentally ending up in a role where I'm working a development program. And so being today on SLS, watching the development of Space Launch System, having, kind of intimately poured through what that looked like in the late 60s, early 70s, and then throughout the 70s into the 80s, there's truth to that. Like, there are things that never change. This is a little bit unique because it's less of a maxim in spaceflight than it is in other businesses, because technology changes. Man, there were things that were a bad idea. You look at Nixon's speech, and I'm not saying the shuttle is a bad idea, but I'm saying you look at Nixon's speech announcing the shuttle, and you look at speeches by Elon Musk, and you can take sentences where they said the exact same thing. Again, I'm a shuttle hugger. I love shuttle, but how the technology has played out over those, 40 years, the effect that you get doing the same thing today, different than the effect that you got doing the same thing 40 years ago. So it's a wonderful inspiration, but you should never let it be an impediment to you.
All right. John, what about you?
Well, when I heard the question, it kind of reminded me about what we wrote about in our book, Come Fly With Us. There's our cover right there. And we cover the Challenger accident pretty extensively, and then we mentioned briefly in the latter chapters a little bit about the Columbia. So the Challenger and the Columbia accidents were separated by 17 years, and I did a lot of aviation safety work in my career, and we've looked at a lot of the factors that lead up to accidents that aren't just involving the crew and pilot error when they use that term, but organizational issues cause accidents too, and it was the organizational issues between Challenger and Columbia, 17 years apart, and they were virtually identical when you look at the management decisions that were being made for different reasons by different people, but they're all very, very similar. Some of the folks that we interviewed for this book actually teach classes still to this day that cover those issues, and I think it was just hard at the time that Columbia happened. The people, NASA, as I'm sure David knows, they never forget an anniversary of one of these accidents. It's in everybody's heads. There's posters everywhere. They talk about it all the time. But I think in the case of Columbia in particular, they weren't making the connection that the decisions they were making had any relation to what happened with Challenger. They didn't realize at the time that they were making the same mistakes, the same bad decisions, as it turned out in hindsight. So I think you have to study the past to realize to keep yourself from making the same mistakes. And those 17 years, you would think there's still people at NASA who would remember those lessons. As time goes on and people move out of the organization, it's going to be important for the next generation of engineers and scientists to read these histories and be able to go back and see what happened back here to prevent it from happening again.
Amy, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I agree across the board. I think as an historian, I always say that it's super important to understand the context of things. To bring up Apollo is sort of like, we constantly doing if we went to the moon in 9 years, why aren't we back there? If we did it then, why aren't we doing it now? Well, we're taking that out of context of the socio-political and economic framework that allowed it to happen and just assuming that it works elsewhere. And people love to just ignore context. So I always kind of love to remind people hey, remember the Cold War? That was also a thing that was happening at the time. You want that again? Because that allowed it. So I just think there's such an important context that comes from history and that allows you to sort of not fall into the same traps. And I've been, we keep seeing the cycle of everyone wants their Kennedy moment. Everyone wants to make that grand pronouncement of something that will then cement them in the history books. And we keep seeing it not work. And you wonder why? Well, historians can probably tell you, but no one wants to listen to historians because they're like, oh, quit living in the past. But the past will help inform your future, and people should, I think, remember that.
Yes, the past will help inform your future. Very good advice. Francis?
So yeah, this is something that we hear a lot used by historians, normally not about the space program. It comes up a lot talking about why wars begin, the same conditions, the rise of extremism that leads to a war. If you don't remember how that happened one time, it's going to happen again. We're hearing it this month, too, with what happened 100 years ago with the pandemic. And here we are again. Did we learn the lessons from last time? You hear this a lot. You don't hear it so much about space, other than some of the points that Amy brought up, which make me very passionate and sometimes quite annoyed at the world, because people do, like Amy said, keep saying, well, if NASA went to the moon then, why can't we do it now? And they often will direct it on people like David Hitt and others like, well, those people could do it. What's wrong with you? Not realizing that NASA and all of the contractors around it, they all have the same incredible, hardworking, innovative, bright people ready to go. Just give them the money, give them the ability, and get out of the way, and we'd be on Mars, we'd be the other side of the solar system by now. But it doesn't happen for the very same reasons you're saying. People go back to the beginning every time. They don't learn from history. The worst thing they can do is say, let's start from the beginning and write another report. And those reports happen, and they're great. They set out a beautiful roadmap, and then they get put on a shelf and not used. And 10 years later, sometimes just 5 years later, often with a different president, a different Congress, another report gets written. This country is really, really good at writing reports. They're not so good at going back to the moon. I just wish people would let people like David give them money, get out of the way, let them do what they're good at.
So it sounds as though you made mention of various wars throughout history and it repeating itself, but it sounds as though NASA and progression of NASA and space exploration is a cyclic form of excitement. So you have those that over a period of time that it isn't happening, it's not in the news media, and then it sort of falls off the mind. But then when you have that pattern of emergence of something new, America's next great ship, SLS, building of that excitement, then it happens. So then you have that launch, then you have that history made, and it just creates that cyclic restart pattern of excitement going forward. So maybe that could be it. And Chris, what about you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd have to agree on the context point. I mean, one of the things that particularly annoys me is nowadays people want to read their history or watch their history in such small condensed chunks, and it's very difficult to tell too much of the story in those chunks. And so you get this kind of almost soundbite treatment of history where people will know about this one particular incident that happened on an Apollo mission but won't understand the preconditions that led to that, the engineering that led to that incident, the other things that, all played a part in it. And, I think when I try and write stuff, I always try and bear in mind it's not just the what, it's the why and it's the how. So, something I'm very interested in, because I'm wearing the T-shirt and everything, is is Dinosaur, famous program from back in the 60s, which is a perennial favorite on the internet. And you get all these people saying, like, you know, there was this thing called the X-20 Dinosaur, and it was going to be this fantastic shuttle. But, you know, it's become famous as this thing that was cancelled by McNamara. And, you know, it could have been something if only McNamara hadn't cancelled it. But you look at that program, and, you know, the thing was really on the skids from the start, and it was in trouble for years. It never really got a sound footing because they always tried to develop it not as an X-plane, but as a weapon system. And the technology wasn't mature enough for that. And, you know, it should just have been an X-plane. It should have been the follow-on to the X-15, but it wasn't. It became the X-20 in the final year of its lifespan. And it's now forever known as this X-plane, but it wasn't. It was trying to be too many things. We've seen that pattern repeated. Again, you know, it is just cyclical. You could see the same thing with NASP, the National Aerospace Plane. You've seen a lot of things with the other single stage to orbit programs that, you know, populate the 80s and 90s and came and went at incredible cost without any hardware ever flying. And, you know, this is kind of the problem if we're only allowed to express ourselves in kind of short form when we're writing the history, that, you know, yeah, some neat things happened, you know, on different missions, but you've got to kind of understand the how, the why, the when, the environment those programs were born into, the limitations that were put on them, and then you can start to understand why something like Dinosaur really never would have worked in the conditions it was, even though it would have been really neat to see it fly.
Well, all of you on our panel today are current, this generation space history authors. So as a current generation studying the past, what advice would you give for the next generation of space authors? Those that are willing, able, excited to be that next history writing person to discover that which is to come. So what would your advice be? Let's start with David.
It doesn't pay. That's, wow. So an interesting thing about being part of this generation is the people that you're talking to on this call today are a bridge. We've had the luxury of interacting with the primary sources, right? You know, I wrote Homesteading Space with people that lived on Skylab. When I started the book, you know, we still had eight of the Skylab astronauts that I could talk to, that I could work with. The day is coming when, you know, and you're going to get to what was it like to be on Skylab when you can't talk to the Owen Garriotts and when you can't talk to the Alan Beans, is to talk to the David Hitts. And that's true for everybody on this call. We're torchbearers for that generation. We have the advantage of the fact that we stole a golden age of spaceflight, right? I mean, you know, writing books about the late 50s through the 60s into the early 70s. I mean, we kind of claimed the good stuff for ourselves on this call. And that said, that's territory that you can never not be able to mine. You know, I mean, there will be books about Apollo written 20 years from now that are good and valuable books about Apollo. But if you're getting started today, don't to be a torchbearer like that. Don't overlook that opportunity to be the person who talks to somebody now who's not going to be here 10 years from now, 30 years from now, 40 years from now, so that when somebody says, what was it like to, you know, be on the International Space Station? Maybe there's no ISS astronauts left, but there are the people that talk to the ISS astronauts, you know, half a century from now. And so there is an incredible value to the books that are written. There's also a value to the people that have written the books, those story keepers that that in a way, you know, secondhand lived the story of capturing the story. And so don't overlook those opportunities. Seize those opportunities any chance you get.
John, what about you?
Well, David's answer is a hard one to follow up. We are very lucky to be in this position in this point in time that we are. And I would highly recommend anybody who has a chance to take on a project like this to interview people firsthand yourselves rather than relying on other interviews. And David makes great points about that. But the one thing you'll find about doing an interview with some of these, particularly the more famous ones, is I was doing an interview with an Apollo astronaut. And they've told the story many times over the years, and the story may have changed slightly over the years, depending on a reaction they got from an audience or something like that. They say, oh, they laughed that time, so I'm going to use that little bit next time. So the story does gradually change unintentionally over the years. And so I was doing the interview over the phone with this astronaut, and he was telling the story. And I had a question to interject. And when I did that, it was like somebody hit the pause button. And he said, well, I'm telling you the story. And then he hit play again, and then he picked up right where he left off and continued telling me the story the way he was going to tell it. There was no interjecting. There was no, trying to get some additional information. So interviews are great. It's thrilling to talk to the people firsthand, and it's a great opportunity to have. But I would highly recommend any writer to do the hard work too. Get into the libraries, get into the memos. I find contemporary memos to be just as, if not more important than modern interviews, because you're not relying on 40 plus years of recollections. You're looking at their thoughts as they put them on paper at that time period in the 1960s. And there's nothing more exciting than going through a stack of boring looking government memos and you see a handwritten note with some colorful language that's clearly in John Young's hand off in the side margin somewhere. It's just fascinating to see those things. And we're seeing that every day now, researching our new book between the astronauts of the early shuttle days that are discussing different aspects of spacewalk and EVA equipment and things like that. So, yeah, two things: do the interviews firsthand. Don't rely on other people's work, and get into the library and do the digging in the old paperwork. It's fascinating.
All right. Amy, what advice would you give to the next generation?
Be extremely kind to your archivists. They will be your best friends. Oh my God. For my last book, Fighting for Space, was all archive research, including like digging up, just as you mentioned, like finding notes and stuff. Like here's a 1937 Western Union telegram that I found on eBay, which like I found all these things kicking around that are useful in research. Find those things. But I had so many little things that I was like trying to track down a detail about a meeting, and I had it in like a letter or a recollection, but I wanted something more firm, and like I wasn't gonna cross the country to go find a memo in the FDR library, as much as I would love to go to all of the presidential libraries. So I emailed an archivist, and they were able to find exactly what I needed and scan it, and we're happy to help. I actually found a clerk in Montgomery County, Georgia, who found Jackie Cochran's original divorce record under her birth name for me, which is like the most incredible thing. He was so adorably excited to be like, this is super cool. I'm like, right? So, reaching out to people, explaining what you're doing, and asking for their help. And every one of them is thanked in my acknowledgments. And I, tried to get books to all of the libraries who helped me and stuff too. It's those people, even though we can travel a lot and a lot of stuff is digital, if you're going back far enough, it's not digitized. And there are people in these locations who are happy to help and get really nerdy and excited about that stuff. And like, they will be your best friends, and they're lovely people. So be nice to your archivists.
Good advice. Francis, in your inspirational words, what would be your advice to the next generation?
Inspiring? Oh, boy. Well, everybody said all the inspiring stuff already, but I do have some other thoughts. As most people have said, we did live in a golden age when we first started writing. We could access so many people from contemporary times way back to the 1940s and 1930s and the birth of rocketry, some of the early aviation pioneers. We were incredibly lucky to talk firsthand with those people. When I first moved to where I am now, here in the San Diego area, I could drive 20 minutes from this house and have lunch with a Mercury astronaut. Now, there are no Mercury astronauts. If you wanted to talk to somebody who controlled a landing on the moon. Now there is one person left you can speak to, Dave Scott of Apollo 15. That's it. He's the only commander left of a lunar landing mission, and he's in his mid to late 80s. That tells you everything. We are losing that window. But I think David and others have made some very good points, which is you look at those classic books of the 60s and 70s, those wonderful space histories. Those were people that did the digging. They went and spoke to people firsthand. They were on site. They were finding out what was going on right now. And we're mistaken if we feel like now any new historians, any future historians have missed their opportunity, because there's stuff happening right now, which is just as exciting, just as incredible. And if somebody doesn't capture it right now, it's going to be lost. I heard Amy say she was very jealous of people living in Huntsville, and I get it. I'm jealous that you drive a Saturn V every day. But Amy lives in Pasadena. They're sending things way further than anybody ever did in Huntsville. They're out beyond the outer planets. They're outside the solar system. All she has to do is drive 5 or 10 minutes, and she can speak to people who are planning some of the most incredible out there solar system stuff, the moons of Jupiter, the moons of Saturn. That stuff's going to happen in the next 10 to 15 years. I stood once in JPL and somebody gave me a piece of milled aluminum, put it in my hand, and they said, this is going to be part of a spacecraft that's going to go out to the outer planets. And I held that in my hand and I thought, wow, when that spacecraft finally did make it out there, I mean, I felt like my DNA was somehow on that. You know, maybe it literally was, probably not. But my soul was going with that spacecraft. So those opportunities are definitely there. Just because there's a well-worn track of what's happened in the past doesn't mean there aren't exciting stuff now. There are weird little companies all around America and around the world doing bizarre little bits of space exploration, and they're all pretty eager to talk to people. So I encourage everybody, college students, school kids, whoever they are, look who's in your area, go talk to them, start writing stuff. It needs to be recorded.
Yep. And Chris, what would your advice be?
Well, I guess I'm coming at it from a slightly different angle because I'm still waiting for my first book to come out. So it's all very recent to me, being standing at the bottom of that Everest and looking, thinking like I'm never going to get there. But one of the things that was incredibly useful and inspirational to me was to talk to other authors. And, you know, at first it was a little bit intimidating, but, you know, I was lucky enough to go out to Space Fest a couple of years ago. I met Francis. He encouraged me to get in touch with University in Nebraska. And I was also lucky enough to spend some time with Dennis Jenkins, who's written the foreword for my book. And he was great. You know, this was somebody whose books I'd been reading for years and just seems like this incredible encyclopedia of every fact. And yet he's an incredibly approachable guy, and he gave me great advice. He did say, you know, books aren't that difficult to write, apart from the first one. The first one feels impossible. So, yeah, it was kind of telling it how it was. He also said you're not going to get rich writing books, certainly not space history ones. So I'm sure he wasn't wrong there. But yeah, talk to authors. I mean, generally people will help you. It's not, you know, quite as jealously guarded as people may imagine. And I guess the other piece of advice that I was given at the outset, which I think is always worth bearing in mind, is you're writing about people's lives. You're writing about people's careers, stuff that just ends up being a footnote in books. That was 10, 15 years of somebody's life. And when you take on writing a history book about this stuff, you're bearing that responsibility of representing that person's efforts. And, you know, their families are going to read it. Their children or their grandchildren will read it. So, you know, do the legwork and try to find out what people were really like, what their contributions really were. If they didn't end up making the program, did they inspire something else that mattered? You know, there's more than the story we often hear. It's a whole tree of things, and we only ever read this one route through it usually. And it's fun to find out the other stuff and try and represent some of that as well.
And looks like David has a comment that he'd like to add. So, David?
Yeah, I just, after Chris's great comment about talk to authors, which is so true, felt obligated to give a shout out to the reason that we're all here on this call, the Outward Odyssey series, because they Francis and I were involved in that from very early on. His books were books 1 and 2. Homesteading Space was book 4. Colin Burgess, in the beginning, there's 2 goals for this. One goal, obviously, we're creating an amazing, comprehensive history of spaceflight. I mean, I don't think there is anything else out there with the breadth that this series has. But his other goal, the more charitable, I guess, was I want to create a new vanguard of space writers. The people that he picked weren't necessarily known names when we signed our contracts with UNP, but they felt it was very important we want to generate a cadre of space writers. And so it's neat seeing people like Jay Galantine that'll be on the Thursday panel that keep coming back to UNP for Outward Odyssey. It's neat seeing people like Francis and like Amy who are involved with Outward Odyssey and then go on and do other things other places. And the influence of this series spreads. And there's a great website, collectspace.com, that a lot of us got our starts on. Colin Burgess, the editor, would post there. And you can go into the messages. There's still Odyssey series. You've got the the next book. Go there, reach out to them. You could be the next Chris, because we're looking for to keep that vanguard growing.
All right. Well, David, since you're here, I'll ask you the next question to start. So, as current generation and exploring what NASA and space exploration of all around commercial space, NASA, federal, all these wonderful agencies making history now, what major human space historic event at this current moment is still science fiction do you hope to live long enough to see, experience, and document in the future?
So your question earlier about what book influenced you, and you asked it about early on, but there is a book more than other that has influenced my attitude about space exploration. It's called Your Trip to Outer Space. And this book was published in, I want to say, 57, 59, somewhere in that time frame. And the point of the book is this: human beings someday are going to be going to outer space. They will even be going to the moon, maybe in your lifetime, possibly by the year 2000. And he's right there. He's right there. He's writing that book. It's, like I said, 57, 59. Gagarin is 2 to 4 years away. The moon landing is roughly a decade away. It's all that close. And he has no idea. And it's easy to, well, golly, how did you have no idea? This guy was a space author, right? I mean, this guy was somebody who knew enough to write a book about space. Like, if we were holding this panel 50 years ago, this guy would be sitting on this telecon. We'd be doing it with tin cans tied to string. But that's who he was. And he had no idea that it was that close. And so, wow. Look at where we are today. We this month have the first launch of U.S. astronauts from a U.S. spacecraft from U.S. soil in 9 years. This is the 5th time. Thanks, Francis. This is the 5th time in history that's happened. This is only the 5th time that there's been a new U.S. crew vehicle to launch. It's the first time it's happened in almost 40 years. That's cool, but that's the beginning. That what we're going to see over the next couple of years is the birth of an American space fleet, right? We're going to have astronauts on 3 different American crew vehicles, all making maiden flights. Boom, boom, boom. And we've gone from we don't have launch capability to a space fleet in just a period of years. We're getting ready to land on the moon again. There's momentum that that we're working towards Mars. So yeah, certainly, definitely. I want to. My joke is I'm of an age that I'm going to go down to Florida. I'm going to watch that Mars launch, and then I'm going to stay there. Like, that's retirement for me. That's that's the age that I'm at. Except that I would love to be wrong, right? I mean, I'd love to be your trip to outer space guy. I'd love to be, how the heck in 2020 did David Hitt think the Mars landings would be until he returned? I would love to be the guy that, that 50 years from now, they're saying, in 2020, how did David Hitt not know that, we've got teleporters coming or warp drive or something? And at the rate things are developing and the way the industry is growing, and I think it was Francis's comment about all these companies and all these cities across not only the nation but the world. Yeah, I look forward to being made to look foolish. I'm excited about that.
All right. Well, John, what is your science fiction to science fact future moment going to be?
Well, honestly, I'd be happy to see another moon landing. That moon landing's been a long ways off for a long time, like David was saying. Of course, I'd like to see Mars happen as well. It seems like as you go through time, the technical challenges that we come to realize about how difficult Mars is, they get in more focus, and we keep on coming up with new roadblocks to why we can't do that. Mars has been 30 years away for the last 40 years, as far as I know. And so I don't know. Am I going to see Mars in my lifetime? Maybe not. I wouldn't be surprised to see a mission to one of the Martian moons, Phobos or Deimos, and do telerobotic work from there. One of my concerns, without getting too crazy here, is that with the advances with artificial intelligence and virtual reality, at some point in the future, we're going to pass the point where it makes sense to have people there as opposed to doing it robotically and having the entire planet be able to share in it almost firsthand. Why spend all the time and money and effort, technology to send 5 or 6 people when you can send a whole theater full of people to experience the same thing? But as far as science fiction goes, the passenger ships of 2001 and all that would be fantastic to see that happen, so that all of us can see, experience firsthand just an orbital space flight. I'd be really excited to see that. If they want me to ride in the back, that's fine. I'd be a lot happier sitting in the front seat and driving the thing. But yeah, it'd be fantastic to see this passenger business finally take off. And maybe we'll see that this year with Virgin Galactic. They just did a glide flight the other day out of their new spaceport there in New Mexico. And Blue Origin's got their capsule coming up. I think we're going to start seeing payload specialist type people like we wrote about fly as scientists and engineers on them, in addition to the paying passenger sightseeing type of astronaut in the future. So I'd be really excited to see that happen in the near term.
All right, Amy, what would be your sci-fi moment to sci future moment? Science.
I'm on Team Lander on Europa or Titan. I'm super interested in what's going on these moons. I think, I of course want to figure out how to get humans to Mars without dying of radiation in the process, and landing on Mars without going splat, because the last time I spoke to some people about the actual landing technologies, they know how to do it, the money's missing, it's all a rich tapestry, to quote Marge Simpson's therapist. But I just think within what we can do, I think we're close to doing these missions, and I'd love to start exploring other places to maybe send humans, because we know a lot about Mars at this point. We're good at Mars. We don't know Europa, we don't know Titan, we don't know that maybe these other moons are a better chance to start sending humans once we have the details about long duration distant human spaceflight kind of sorted. So I'm up for, I want to see more exploration of these things, and I think that's closer actually, and I'm hoping to see that.
All right, Francis, what's your science fiction to fact moment?
Well, Joe, I can't answer your question, but the reason I can't answer your question is way more interesting, I think, than if I could answer your question. Okay. We are on Mars right now with rovers. We've infested Mars with rovers. They're driving all over the place, looking at everything. They've been there for years. They're doing incredible stuff. And yet we have not been there in person. And a lot of people are saying, well, isn't a robot enough? And certainly for those first explorations, they are enough. But think about two things I was fortunate enough to write about, which was Apollo 8, the first mission to leave Earth orbit and head somewhere else. I sat down with Bill Anders, who was on that Apollo 8 mission, flew back in 1968, first people to leave close to the Earth. And the way he described it is they went out to the moon, they took photos which the robot probes had taken before, they saw things that robots had seen before, but he saw the Earth rise. For the very first time, human eyes saw the Earth rise over that lunar horizon and saw this tiny little jewel in the darkness of space that was so far away and so tiny and so fragile looking that he could put his thumb out and block it all out. Everything would be blocked out, all behind his thumb. Everybody he'd ever known, everybody who'd ever lived, everything that ever happened for everybody was behind his thumb. There is an experience that no robot can have and no picture that came back from a robot could convey. And he came back and everybody asked him formally, informally, what was it like to go to the moon? And he said, we went all the way to the moon. And what did we discover? We discovered our own planet. I was fortunate enough also to work with Al Worden of Apollo 15. He spent 6 days in orbit around the moon, 3 of them totally alone. Some of that time he was around the far side of the moon from Earth. The sun is blocked. The Earth is blocked. The moon is in shaded side, so he's not seeing any light apart from the stars. You can tell where the moon is because that's where the stars stop in a big curve in the sky. Other than that, he's looking out at this blizzard of stars, a little bit like your background behind you. He can't tell how many stars there are. And he starts thinking about what this means. He is a tiny little representative of humanity, almost on the very tip of what's technological possible, looking out at this, thinking, what are we as humanity? Are we the only people here? What does this mean for humanity? He never in his lifetime came up with answers, but he was the first human to really be able to feel that question and really be able to experience it deeply, not just intellectualize it, but experience it. So I'm really happy we are exploring with robots. But the great thing about the reason I can't answer your question is we don't know that until we go do it. Bill Anders did not know he was going to have that experience until he was there. Al Worden did not know until he was there. And there's something very wonderful about that, which is we need to do it to find out the questions, never find the answers. So we need to do it.
So it's not just seeing history, it's feeling history.
Feeling history, yeah.
And Chris, what would your science fiction to fact moment be?
It feels quite tough to follow that. Thanks, Francis. I guess kind of like a lot of us on the call tonight, I come from that first generation to be told in our classrooms that one of you guys is going to be the first to walk on Mars. And now a couple of generations later, we're still telling kids in classrooms that, and I hope I see it in my lifetime. But the thing I would really, really like to see, which I think is eminently technologically possible, is just really good routine access to space. We have the technology to do it, and maybe we're starting to see that now with the private companies coming through. But, given my interests, I still want to see a really good space plane. and this thing, one of these days it's going to happen. I was incredibly disappointed when the commercial crew decision was made and they went for 2 capsules. And I know there was lots of good practical reasons for it, but, I'm still hoping that this little guy makes it at some point, because there are so many advantages to something like a lifting body. It can do things that capsules can't. And again, I was saying earlier about, history is this big tree, reverse tree full of branches, and we only see the one route that succeeds a lot of the time. And much as I love Apollo, what a fantastic endeavor it was, it kind of cut off a lot of other things at the time. And things like lifting bodies and some of the other technologies, there's a lot of potential there, and I hope we pursue them. And I hope I see that sooner than I see somebody walk on the moon or Mars again.
All right. So thank you. That concludes those questions. I have some questions here pulled from social media from people that have asked. So I have 5 of them. So I'm going to ask each one of you a certain question. So please answer to the best of your ability. So I'll start with this first question for David Hitt. Avery asks, what's the silliest story about astronauts that you know?
Oh, gosh. I may have to get you to come back to me on that one. There's a lot of stories, and not all of them can be not all of them can be told.
Are any interesting stories of collaborating with the Skylab astronauts in writing your book?
Well, so it's not silly, but and Francis probably has this experience as well. It was really neat to me. I would working on homesteading space, working with Joe Kerwin and Owen Garriott, and particularly Owen Garriott lived here in Huntsville. And so it was easy for us we're going to meet up for lunch and talk about the book. And we'd go to the local steak place outside the mall, and we'd sit down and we'd have lunch and we'd talk about the book. And the fascinating thing was, I'm sitting across the table from somebody that lived in space for 2 months, and the waiter has no idea, right? Like, this is not a famous person. This is not a celebrity. This is not like I'm sitting across the table from Tom Cruise. And nobody in that restaurant except he and I know. And it's a good reminder. You go out to the grocery store and you're buying groceries and there's somebody ahead of you in line. You don't know who that person is. And really living here in Huntsville, yeah, the person at the self-checkout line who's taken forever on his 15 groceries to get them scanned could have put somebody on the moon. And how would you treat them? How patient would you be if you knew that? And, and and we shouldn't treat people special because they put people on the moon. We should treat people that put people on the moon special because they're people. But it was a really humbling reminder of all of our humanity. And that's not a silly story at all. When he was up there, decided to. This was a story that's in the book that he was very proud of. That he would talk about any time that we would do an event, talk to the public. He would talk about how he smuggled his wife onto Skylab. Before the flight, he had this great idea that he was going to record his wife on an old audio tape. And he's going to take that up to Skylab with him. And Owen Garriott being Owen Garriott, I mean, there was nothing that he couldn't overthink. So this couldn't be a simple process. He's got to do this right. So what are the possible things that could happen during this flight? Well, maybe there'd be a hurricane, or maybe there'd be a volcano, or maybe there'd be wildfires. And so he records his wife saying, well, I see the hurricane. Wildfire, I see the volcano, whatever, so that when he's up there, he can pick the day, something's going on, she's talking about something that's clearly happening right then. Pre-organizes this with the Capcom, with the person in mission control that's going to be talking to the spacecraft, so that there's going to be no way of knowing how he did this. Like, it's going to sound like his wife was on Skylab. And so he pulled this off. It worked flawlessly. Now, nobody for a second believed his wife was on Skylab. I mean, right? Like, everybody knew she's on the Earth. Everybody knows it's a trick. It's an impressive trick. How did you do it? And so the part of this that amused me more than anything, more than the trick that he pulled, was how incredibly proud this man in his 70s and 80s was about this trick that he pulled 30 years ago. I mean, like, every chance he got, he would, let me tell you about this trick that I pulled on mission control 40 years ago. The really cool thing was, as we were finishing up the book, the month the book came out, his son Richard got to go to the space station. And as we are talking today, May 5th, Cinco de Mayo, National Astronaut Day, National Museum Appreciation Day, by the way, Joseph, we appreciate the museum. Headline came out today, Tom Cruise is working on the first movie to be shot in space. Completely untrue. The first movie to be shot in space was shot by Richard Garriott back in 2008 while he was aboard the International Space Station. He made a 5-minute science fiction movie called Apogee of Fear. You can watch it on YouTube. In this movie, he has a cameo by his mom smuggled onto the International Space Station. And so it was so neat seeing him 35 years later making a shout out to this prank that his dad pulled back in 1973. So, and again, it's a good joke, but not nearly as entertaining as how proud of it they were. So astronauts, there's people too. They have senses of humor too. Yeah, their sense of humor could be like anybody, but it's fun to watch.
All right. John, as an aviator, this question is for you. So we have Lincoln asking, what high school or college classes should I take if I want to be like you, an aviator or an astronaut?
Oh, that's a great question. I was in my first year of college when I signed up for a class called Introduction to Aeronautics, and I assumed it was going to be kind of a engineering science oriented class, and it turned out when I got into it that it was the introductory class to taking your private pilot written exam. And I didn't quite know what I was getting into, but the next thing that led to was going down to the local airport and renting a Cessna 152 and starting to take flying lessons. So I kind of fell into it by accident. But if you're going to go to school for it, there's specific colleges for that around the country that you can go and sign up just to do flying as a professional flying career. I would also recommend having a backup plan, because there's not always a clear path when you sign up that I'm going to get there, I'm going to get to an airline, or I'm going to get into the military. Medical things could happen that disqualify you. So by all means, have a backup plan in case flying doesn't work out for you. There's even been astronauts that stopped being astronauts because it turned out that flying just wasn't for them back in the day. But by all means, pursue the dream and study hard at whatever you do, and stay in school and hang around the local airport. I know a lot of guys that got started flying just hanging around the glider ports and places like that, and they'd help pull planes around and position them, and then they'd get rides and lead into lessons from that. So hanging around the local airport's always a good thing, but definitely pursue it in school and have a backup plan. It's a tough business. It can be a really tough business for those who think that you just learn how to fly one day and you have this endless career into the airlines or into the military, and it all works out great. For every guy you see wearing that uniform, just like astronauts, for everyone you see, there's dozens and dozens who didn't make it for whatever reason. And not that they're less people, they just run up against one of those walls that kept them from getting all the way to the top. So keep at it.
All right. Amy, we have Amelia is asking, what's your favorite space vehicle, real or fake? Mine is the battle cruiser from the Expeditionary Force book series by Craig Allenson.
Well, I'm going to have to go with the real one, because this is where I feel bad. I'm not a sci-fi person. I've never actually watched any Star Trek. My favorite spacecraft is definitely the Gemini spacecraft. I actually do have a Gemini Regalo tattoo, actually. It's tiny. You can't really see it, but I think for me, that was always my favorite spacecraft to read about. I love writing about those missions. Gemini was the first one that was like, Mercury was very automated, but it was the first and everyone's really excited about it. Apollo went to the moon and everyone loves it. And then you have Gemini, NASA's overlooked middle child, that actually did so much for the agency. It really taught NASA how to live and work in space. It saw developments of all the things that allowed Apollo. It was this amazing, 10 missions in 20 months? I mean, that's an insane launch rate. It had some of the most incredible, Gemini 6 failed, so it launched coincident with Gemini 7 as Gemini 6A and became the first time they actually managed 2 vehicles in space at the same time and got so close that they could read notes in the window. I mean, everything that happened in that program is just sort of such an amazing step forward for NASA, and it doesn't get enough love. And it was so malleable. They tried to land it on land with a glider, which is what this is, which was like the weirdest little footnote of that, and it was a very expensive footnote. So yeah, that's always my favorite is Gemini, just because of the unloved position it gets, but how interesting it really was in the scheme of things.
All right. Francis, Rhett asks, if you could go back in time and watch any historical event, which one would you choose?
Ooh. Great question, Brett. And before I answer it, we should make sure that we thank Joe today, because Joe has been doing, we're talking to kids and talking about kids. Joe's been doing these virtual lessons. I don't know if everybody who's been watching knows this. He's been, with the museum shut down, he's been out there talking to kids, doing these incredible hands-on dynamic lessons out there, and it's really making a difference. So thank you, Joe, for everything you're doing. You're kind of my hero right now for what you're doing to keep all this going. What would I want to do? What would I want to see? That's a great question, Brett. There's so many places I'd want to be. There's so many things I'd want to do. That's a almost impossible question for me to answer. But the first thing that comes to my mind, which is on our theme today, would be to watch the very first human-powered flight, the Wright brothers, well over 100 years ago, because one of those things I've been able to pick up bit by bit over time is how different the experience was from the photos. You see this black and white picture of it. I think we've all seen it, of this beautiful white canvas and wood airplane. Looks like it's sort of soaring away. It flew less distance than the wingspan of a standard commercial jet today. It was a quick up and down flight. I've also stood right next to a replica of the engine, and it sounds like somebody is mowing the lawn a foot away or an inch away from your ear. It is an incredibly loud experience. So I've learned enough to know that the picture is quite deceptive, and that what it would have been would be a very short, very loud, very bumpy experience. But because of that, it's almost more interesting, and I'd like to get into that and actually find out what that was like.
All right. And Chris, Max asks, if you could be a part of any fictional team or group, which one would you choose, and what would your role be? Like captain of the Starship Enterprise or a companion of the Doctor?
Oh, I don't know. That's a tough one. I don't know. You really got me stumped with that one. I would rather answer some of the earlier questions, but no. I don't know. I guess I'd like to be somebody going out and living in space and discovering something. Again, I've never been into Star Trek either, and I don't mean to offend anybody with that, but it's never.
Let's sort of phrase it around a historical perspective. What historical team or group, like the Apollo mission team or something like that, would you want to be a part of?
Well, I mean, if I could have been a part of a crew, I guess. The Apollo crew, I always think it would just have been great to be part of, and I know a lot of people would say this, is 12, just because they seemed like they had a blast. And, to do something like that with your friends, there were a lot of crews that weren't like that. But for those guys, I think, they genuinely were there together, experiencing the wonder and the terror at some moments as well. So it would have been great to be a part of a crew like that. And there will be other crews, as we go forward, and they have to look for better compatibility between people as hopefully we start to go out on longer missions. It's going to be really interesting to look at the dynamics they have to find between crews, and they try to build between crews for that. So, something like Apollo 12 would have been a blast, but being part of a real good little team and going out and seeing things people haven't seen before, or, doing something unique, that'd be great. Whatever sci-fi that I can't quite think of would be called?
Technically, you are part of one awesome team called the Outward Odyssey series. So you have that team going for you.
Well, yeah, we're famous for our superpowers.
That's it. Well, that concludes our social media questions, and that concludes our Pass the Torch, the stories behind the exhibits. I wanted to thank all of you, Chris, Francis, Amy, John, and David, for joining us with our panel discussions and the valuable information that you passed along to our viewers. And for our viewers, thank you for joining us. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of our history discussion today. And as with the U.S. Space and Rocket Center, we thank you for joining in. Please visit us online with our Facebook channels, Twitter, all the other social medias, and check out our educational series that Francis made mention to, Science Never Stops, on our Facebook page. So again, thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you for joining in, and good night ad Astra.